will be. So first of all, I would like to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's participating in today's webinar. I'm Marium and I'm working as a Senior Project Officer with UNDP's Merged Areas Governance Project, and I will be moderating today's session. The UNDP's Merged Areas Governance Project supports the government of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Pakistan in providing technical assistance to policymaking in critical areas such as access to electricity. The ongoing Merged Areas Reforms Policy Series aims to invite discussion around key current development themes which are informed by global practice and knowledge. In this regard, today's seminar attempts to determine the unintended adverse effects of unreliable electricity and its possible policy implications. The seminar features behavioral economist Professor Michael Price from the Australian National University, who will be presenting on the subject. This will be followed by contributions by our discussants, the Honorable Federal Secretary for Energy, Mr. Ali Raza Bhutta, and Dr. Nadeem Haque, who is serving as the Vice-Chancellor for Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, who will be providing an informed lens into the theme of the seminar today. We're fortunate enough to have collaborated on our 5th seminar today with Pakistan Institute of Development Economics, and we're very grateful that they've allowed us to go live on their platform today as well. Also, please note that we will have a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free to type your question in the Q&A tab in front of your screen anytime during the seminar, but we will be getting to it after our speakers and discussants have spoken. Also, please note that do indicate the speaker or the discussant that you would like to respond to your query. Also, our Facebook audience can also share their questions in the comments section, and we will try to get to them. Also, do mention your name and organization. So without any further ado, let us move to our keynote speaker of the day. I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Michael Price. He's an internationally recognized expert in behavioral economics and the use of field experiments. Professor Price serves as the Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. He's also serving as a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has advised MAGP on issues of electrification, on COVID-19, implications for the government of KP vis-a-vis the economy and field experiments, and has been instrumental in helping MAGP translate research into policy. Today, he will be attempting to answer the question, what is the real cost of unreliable electricity in the merged areas? So please join me in welcoming Professor Michael Price.
I'm sorry, Mike, I'll just let you begin, but can I just double check if Dr. Nadeem Saab is here? And the Secretary Power Division are two discussants?
I'm here.
Dr. Nadeem is there.
Nadeem Saab has joined in.
Achha, theek hai ji, please then continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And so what I want to focus on the 20 minutes or so that I have for the talk is thinking about, I'm going to call them hidden costs of unreliable electricity service, but it's thinking about costs that escape our attention, or think about behaviorally motivated costs that would be related to the reliability of electricity service in an area. And if we think about what the motivation is for this, sort of the big picture, it's linked between the importance of energy and development. And so, I thought I would start with this quote from the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, where he expresses the importance of energy in the development context by saying, energy is the golden thread that connects economic growth, social equity, and an environment that allows the world to thrive. Development is not possible without energy. So what does this translate into in the policy? Really, this is getting around focusing on the importance, and when you think of the policy perspective, there's this idea of the importance of connecting people to the grid, that it's access to energy is a primary aim for development policy. This is motivated by the fact, if you look around the globe, currently there are around 1.1 billion individuals who lack access to electricity, and just under 3 billion individuals that rely on solid fuels for cooking or heating. So even if you're thinking about no connections, you're around 1 billion people. Where it's say there's limited connections on it, you have 3 billion that are using alternate fuel sources for cooking and heating. And so this is going to have pose challenges both from a development perspective, but also thinking about health, environmental quality, these things. Again, this motivates this policy aim of let's connect people to the grid. And what has been the policy solution on that is saying, okay, if we want to connect people to the grid, we need to increase investments in generation, distribution, and transmission networks. Right? So we want to get access out to the people. The question then becomes, though, is are all connections beneficial? Underlying that policy goal of connect as many people as possible, and that by 2050 we want to connect, have increased connections by X hundred million on it. Underlying that is that any connection is beneficial. Now, there's a lot of common concerns with that have been expressed at different points that are not going to be part of this talk. So what do I not want to focus on? Yes, there are certainly financial concerns. Right? There's concerns about what is the return on the investment to grid connections. And here, these are arguments that focus around, well, okay, it's not just the cost of building new plants. It's not just the cost of building transmission capacity, distribution capacity. Once you build the plants, once you build the transmission and distribution lines, you need to maintain them. So there's still maintenance costs on it. There's also issues about saying, okay, yes, you connect people to the grid, but then are they able to afford the electricity? So then you introduce the idea of, well, maybe to make it accessible and to realize the benefits from it, you have to provide price subsidies. There's also issues around technical or non-technical loss. So even once you connect it, once you're maintaining the grid, there still could be revenue shortfalls that are coming through the fact that there's loss that's related to just technical capabilities or loss that is associated with piracy or non-repayment. There's also a focus on reliability that this talk will focus on reliability, but in a different way. So the direct cost of reliability is this argument that disruptions are costly. And so as you increase connections, you may have a perverse impact on reliability. What does this line of thought think on it? It's arguments around, well, okay, you connect a firm to the grid. You have a garment factory that is connected to the formal grid. If there's a disruption to their electricity service, there's a productivity loss for it. So whatever they were working on, they stop. There's a period of time when the factory shuts down. And in fact, in the context of a garment factory, if you had sewn half of a leg of a pant leg you were doing, you sew half of it. Now power goes out, you're going to have to stop, pull out the thread that you were sewing to do, and restart over again. So there's the disruption in terms of time, but also there could be materials that are lost because of power. This also leads to mitigate that. There's concerns with the cost of disruptions that say this leads to inefficient levels of capitalization, or you have expenditures on backup generation to try to mitigate some of these, and that these backup sources of electricity are more expensive. There's also concerns with the management of the grid and the risks of unplanned outages. Right? As you connect more people, it changes the stress on the grid, it adds to logistical complexity. So there's a lot of concerns that have been documented. I don't want to downplay these, I wanted to mention them quickly, but this is not what I want to focus on for this. What I want to focus on is what I'm going to call the hidden cost of electrification, or think of it as the behavioralist as a grid designer. So this is drawing upon my interest and my experience coming from the behavioral economics perspective. And there's going to be two real areas of concern from the behavioral perspective that are related to electrification and the reliability of new connections coming in and the reliability of pre-existing connections. The first concern is going to be issues around stress. And what is the issue with stress? Well, if you look at stress, there's a growing body of work in behavioral economics, social psychology, that explores how unanticipated shocks or disruptions to our daily routine become a source of stress. So what is the idea? I have some work looking at in Alabama, where I lived before I moved to Australia and started working at the Australian National University, that the biggest city and the capital of Alabama is Birmingham. And in Birmingham, Alabama, the interstate highway that goes through downtown is an overpass. So there's service roads underneath, the highway over top. On a daily basis, there's about 500,000 cars that would go over that overpass on a daily basis. In 2019, they closed a 2-mile stretch of that overpass for 18 months because the infrastructure was crumbling. So they wanted to repair, they were doing repair on this overpass. That led to 500,000 cars being rerouted each day and had about people's commute increased by about 20 minutes to a half hour each way per day. And it became there were newspaper reports about stress, that this, people were stressed out with it. So the shock, this disruption became a big source of stress. And in fact, we looked at it, and yes, you saw significant increases in people's reported daily stress and mental well-being and anxiety, right? So there's lots of evidence out there that disruptions or changes in our daily routine cause stress. So what is the link with electricity? Well, if you think about it, an unplanned outage is a disruption to your daily routine. It can be a source of stress. I can remember about 5 years ago, I was working on a project with the World Bank, and it was a rural electrification project in Bangladesh. And as part of that, before we started the work on it, we did a mission trip, and we were going around and we were talking to villagers. So these were small villages outside of Dhaka that had recently been electrified. And one of the things that a common theme that came out in the discussions with them is that, there was the sense that while there were some tremendous benefits of electrification coming, how they were able to change their daily routine in a number of beneficial ways, there was still the sense that disruptions were costlier than they thought, and that there was some source of frustration in that, wow, I thought that our lives would improve so much with it. We thought that things like my child comes home from school, and it used to be when they came home from school, we would have them immediately, they would have to start working on their homework. Why? Because there was daylight. We wanted to make sure that while they could see in the home, they were doing their any schoolwork that they had while there was still light time. The village becomes electrified, we have lighting, we think, well, now we don't have to, we can allow our kids to come home and be kids. If they want to go outside and spend time with their friends with it, they can, because they can study at night, they can do work at night, because we have lights in the home. Then we're like, so very quickly we start realizing that that's not necessarily the case, because the lights may not be on in the evening when we want it. So now, at least before, we could plan, and we knew as soon as they came home from school, you had to do your schoolwork on, because this is where you have the light. Now there's this uncertainty. Are the lights going to be on at night? If so, then yeah, go out and you can do something. Enjoy the afternoon, enjoy time with your friends. If not, you need to study now. And that uncertainty, they would express it. They weren't necessarily using the word stress or anxiety, but the way they were talking about it was that it was a stressor. So it matters, right? And that. Now then, the next link in sort of putting this together is saying, well, okay, so Mike, you can convince me that maybe reliability is a source of stress, right? I get that. I believe that. But why should we be concerned with stress? Why, if you're thinking about, all the benefits that are being promised through electrification, why would stress matter? How is that really going to impact well-being? Well, stress matters because, again, there's a well-established link in the literature on saying stress changes our preferences. Stress leads us to make poor decisions. So again, thinking through the lens of the behavioral economist, what you can think of is that stress gets us to think fast. Okay, so Kahneman and Tversky have this idea of thinking fast and thinking. Well, the idea of the fast thinking self, it's your impulsive self, it's you make mistakes, you rely upon shortcuts. And then you think fast, the decisions that you make, after you realize the implications of the decisions that you've made thinking fast, you wish you had made a different decision. So this idea of I have these two selves on it. I have my fast thinking self and I have my slow thinking self. I would like to make the decisions that are calculated and rational that would arise if I'm thinking slowly. When I'm thinking fast, there's a gap between it. Okay? So this idea of why stress matters, it gets you to think fast. And what does thinking fast do? Thinking fast has been shown in the context of risk attitudes that people become more risk averse. There's a number of studies, for example, the work by Pam Chikala and her co-author, they did was they were saying, let's look at, go back in a region where there had been recent conflicts going on and there had been recent violence, military activity in it. Let's go back, look, those that were exposed to the military activity versus villages where there were surrounding villages where there was no activity, there were differences in stress. Then they would say, okay, now let's look at how does stress impact their decision to allocate funds between a risky or a safe alternative. So if you're given a choice between a risky alternative versus one that's safe, so saying a 50% chance at getting 500 rupees versus a 50% chance at getting 200 rupees versus 250 rupees with certainty, which would you prefer? They would say those that were exposed to stress would take these, are more likely to take the certain option, would try to reduce risk. Okay. There's an ultimate body of work that looks at, instead of looking at it in the context of risk attitudes, it's looking at it in the context of time preferences. So this is saying, how do I evaluate $1 today versus $1 in the future? Do I put more weight on things that are happening in the present or more weight on things that are happening in the future? And this is the documents that there's a link. As people become stressed, as they think faster, they're more impatient. So what I'm doing, I focus more on the things and the choices that are in front of me. So I care more about consumption or my well-being today, and I'm foregoing investments or things that will look in the future. Everything from a development perspective, I'll consume today, I will borrow and I'll consume today, and I won't save for the future because I don't value the future as much as I do the current. And so stress command not only does it change how I'm going to allocate between risky and safe alternatives, so I may forego potential returns because I'm not willing to take on risk. It also says how I'm going to allocate money or how I'm going to allocate activities over time. I'm going to focus more on the things that are in front of me today and forego potential benefits in the future. There's slightly less work, but there's a similar story that links stress with altruism. And the idea here is that as I become more and more stressed, I become more and more selfish. So it changes my altruism. When I'm stressed and I'm focusing on me, the immediate needs in front of me, I am less likely to share resources with others that are going to be split. I'm less likely to trust other people. So again, this link between, informal insurance or willingness to help each other out to provide common goods that are going to make everybody better off could be negatively impacted by stress. Further to put this in, again, why in the development context is this particularly pronounced? So if you're thinking about the merged areas, why could this be particularly problematic in a region like the merged areas? It's this link between stress and poverty traps. So the idea of a poverty trap and stress and poverty traps, it's the behavioral version of basically saying that poverty begets poverty. The intuition is that poverty leads to poor decisions that lead to future poverty. And what is the mechanism through that? And this is, again, where electrification. So you have an unreliable electric system, it triggers stress. Stress triggers these poor decisions that you make. You take on less risk, you're more impatient, you're less altruistic. That leads to constraints in the future. You have future poverty, that then leads to, in the future, poor decisions. And so it's this cycle. Decisions that you make today because of the stress and because of this depletion of cognitive resources that is triggered by poverty and stress leads you to make decisions that reinforce those constraints, that stress in the future. And so it's this never-ending cycle. It's very hard to break out of poverty. So the idea is that these poverty cycles, it's hard to break poverty because it's this self-reinforcing system. Okay? So the big picture with that is, why does it matter? Unreliable connections. In fact, may do more harm than they do good. They could exacerbate poverty traps. They could enhance poverty cycles. A second concern on it, it's related, but a slightly different story on it, concerns aspiration gaps with it. And increasingly in economics, there's focus on what they're calling aspirations, or what do you believe your life should be? What are you striving for? So this is kind of underlying motivation. And the basic idea here is that aspirations, while they can be a source of inspiration, right? I invest in new projects. I take risks. I want to get ahead because I aspire. I look out there and I see there's something better for me. I can improve myself. There's improved well-being. So aspirations, while they can be a source of inspiration, they lead me to exert this effort and try new things on it. They can also be a source of frustration. So work on aspirations in the development context is saying, there's aspiration gaps or aspiration traps, they're calling it. And the idea is whether aspirations become a source of inspiration or a source of frustration is how do they evolve or change with life shocks? So, if a project comes in, my village is electrified, and I have this belief that all of a sudden there are all these things that I was unable to do before that now are going to be open up for me. We're going to be able to bring in new sources of employment, new opportunities for investments in our child's well-being. We can open up new schools, or it would allow for improved healthcare, have better hospitals, right? Things that could be in that were unable when if you didn't have a connection to an electric grid. You believe that I'm going to have these tremendous improvements in my well-being. But then if the electricity system that you have, if there's a lack of reliability, even if you are made better off, even if there are improvements, they seem like you're falling further and further behind. So this concern, again, is that you can get this gap between what is expected or what I'm anticipating and what is realized. So again, how could this arise with it? One that's outside of sort of the strict neoclassical is saying, there should be some caveats if you're thinking about electrification, what are the benefits and how you should manage expectations, and that it's not simply enough to have a connection to a grid, right? Electricity is just an intermediate input into the household, producing goods and services or doing more things in your home. Electricity is not something, the final good that I consume. It's not like food. It's not like a vehicle that I can get in and I directly use, that I'm using and I'm consuming. And I don't consume an electron or a kilowatt hour that's coming into my home. I use a kilowatt hour that's coming into my home to power a light, to power a refrigerator, to power a radio on it. And what is the benefit that I get from that? I'm able to store food if it's a refrigerator. I'm able to work in the evenings if it's a light bulb, that I have light in my home at times when I wouldn't have otherwise. So there's more things I can do. If I have the radio or TV, I'm exposed to information and knowledge, and I can do things. I get sources of entertainment and information that were unavailable potentially to me beforehand. So this is intermediate input, but to use it, that means that it requires additional investment. So there could be investment constraints that lead to this gap. And then from the behavioral side, it could be, again, this reliability on it. That if I have this unreliable system, I'm unable to do the things that I want, and it becomes the source of frustration. Okay. So the big picture on this is that you could have this, yes, electrification comes in, but if it's unreliable, it could actually, again, do more harm than good, because it can trigger this aspirations gap or this aspirations trap that leads to this ultimate sense of frustration and despair. So what is, to wrap up on it, what would be the policy advice? So, it sounds very pessimistic on what I was saying, and I don't want to leave with a pessimistic note on it. And I would think, so, you know, what would I say as the advice if where I was thinking on this? I would say, if you think about these, you know, what are the costs of reliability, or what are the benefits, or things that erode the benefits of electrification? You need to be cognizant of there's a trade-off between access and reliability. And maybe a revised goal, rather than the sheer number of connections, the focus should be on improving high quality connections. That, you know, not all connections recognized, not all connections are created equal. And rather than investing in just expanding the grid, expand the grid in areas where it can be high quality on it. A second takeaway on it is that there's an important complementarity potentially between solar and grid connections. So that, what do I mean here? That there should be this focus on the use of solar rather than as a substitute, on saying, is it that I connect to the formal grid, or do I use rooftop or household solar or village level solar to power up the village? There should be an increased attention and focus on solar as a backstop, solar as a complement, so that solar is not just the primary, is not necessarily the primary source of power for a household, but it's a source of power that, if the connection to the formal grid, if there's an unplanned outage, it's the backup on it, the backstop. So there can be a complementarity between solar and the formal grid. And of course, as a social scientist, I'm going to give the plug, and this is where we're going as part of continued focus with the UNDP projects on it, is increased data collection, and to really continue to nail down and identify what are these hidden costs and how important are they. So, you know, to expand and better understand these behavioral aspects of energy access and reliability on it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very insightful. So thank you for that. We are honored to have amongst us the Federal Secretary for Energy, Mr. Ali Raza Bhutta. He's a senior bureaucrat, and Mr. Bhutta has also served as the Secretary of Finance in the government of KP in the past. So, sir, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Sir, based on your experience and expertise in the energy sector, we would like you to speak on the government's commitment to improving the access to electricity in the merged areas. So, sir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marium. And thank you, Professor Price, for a very focused presentation. I think as what Professor Price did was focus on the costs of unreliable electricity in terms of the impact on the individual's well-being, happiness, and the stress that it causes. But he specifically excluded the impacts of unreliable energy on the productivity and economic activities, which is fine. But most of the factors that he has highlighted are true for all of Pakistan. Merged areas are special, and they are special because of the special conditions that have prevailed in those areas in terms of provision of electricity services over the last century or so. Three pillars that we have. The government of Pakistan has approved, the Council of Common Interest has in June, the national electricity policy for the country. And the three pillars of that are reliability and accessibility, affordability, and sustainability. As far as the merged areas are concerned, the issue, in my view, is that of sustainability, because even if we discount the factor of lack of feasibility of connecting all the population centers in the merged areas with the national grid. Because the population is so dispersed, since the terrain is so difficult, that is not going to be, the connectivity to the national grid is not going to be feasible financially ever, I mean, in the foreseeable future. But the issue, that issue can be overcome with injection of capital resources for once. The real issue in the tribal areas is that the operational expenditures can also not be met. The culture in the merged districts of not paying your electricity bills actually results in making the proposition of connection to the national grids and providing reliable and continuous electricity in these areas extremely difficult. Now, even the percentage of population, and there is a significant percentage of the population that has access to the national grid, electricity provided through the national grid, even there, we cannot provide them electricity 24 hours in a day, because the arrangement at the moment is that the federal government picks up the bill for all residential consumers in the tribal areas, and the federal government has a fiscal constraint. So the packet that we get in terms of that operational expenditure is 18 billion. And we provide electricity worth more than 18 billion during the year. So even those who are connected to the national grid get electricity at best for 5 or 6 hours a day. And that makes the entire system subject to criticism. But how does one overcome that? In my view, the only possible way of expanding electricity supply in the merged districts is to have off-grid solutions, mini or microgrids, based either on mini or micro hydro projects, or on battery-backed solar projects, wherever feasible. But that will all again have to be, those will have to be backed up by organizations of the communities who, even if the capex is provided by the federal government or any other agency, who are responsible for the operations and for collecting bills and maintaining the projects. Other than that, it does not seem feasible. I mean, marginal increments can be made. We continue to make them, but that will not be sustainable. I will take this opportunity of suggesting 2 areas for further research and discussion before I stop. I think we need to start to conduct experiments, do pilot projects on how the culture of paying bills for the utilities can be promoted. And I think we also need to do some research on the real cost of providing electricity to the entire population in a reliable and sustainable manner. It can be a policy choice. The government can decide, the provincial government or the federal government, that we will continue to pick up the bill for the operations of providing electricity for the residential consumers. And this issue is primarily with the residential consumers, not with the commercial and industrial consumers. They do pay their bills in the merged districts. But the real cost, we need to calculate that. If we provide electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to the entire population of FATA, what is the bill going to be like? And then one can compare the costs of not providing this electricity and see if it is a feasible proposition. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. These are some very useful comments. Well noted. Thank you. I would now like to remind everyone that please do share your questions and comments in the comment section. We will be getting to them towards the end of the session. So if you have any queries, and also please do indicate that who the speaker or discussant that you would like for them to respond to it. So you can do that. I would now like to invite our next discussant. So I would now like to invite a collaborator this morning, Dr. Nadeem Haque, who's our second discussant. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Dr. Nadeem Haque is currently the Vice-Chancellor of PIDE. He's also served as the Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of Pakistan from 2010 to 2013. Apart from his work in Pakistan, Nadeem Haque Saab has also worked for the International Monetary Fund for 24 years. With his extensive experience in policy development and economic planning, Dr. Nadeem Haque will comment in today's discussion and share his views. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think UN has done a great job by getting Michael Price to come and talk about the merged areas. We had a good study. I think Bhutta Saab's comments were spot on. I don't need to add much more. He did a very good job. Let me just say that this is a common problem with behavioral and experimental studies that people like Deaton and many people have highlighted, that they lack context. They tend to sort of do the same thing that they've done elsewhere. And here we see, yes, there's been a stress on stress and on aspiration and all those things, but that's very similar to what prevails in Alabama or Australia. But as the Secretary pointed out, merged areas are a very different ballgame. And quite frankly, context is very important, and we should take context into account. And perhaps the initiator of the study, UNDP, should have thought of context before they initiated the study. Connecting individuals to the grid or connecting merged areas to electricity is an issue that we've discussed many times in this country. And again, I think UNDP should be aware of it. We discussed this when World Bank was talking about rural industrialization and when the World Bank was talking about rural electrification. And yes, we paid the price for it. We stretched the grid, and now the grid is so far stretched that the grid is creaking and there are line losses all over the place. And one of the big issues in circular debt is containing line losses, which arise from stretching the grid. So I would argue, as the Secretary argued, and I would compliment on that what we need is context now. And UNDP has to give the context to the study to tell us what we can learn, because stretching the grid has costs and benefits. So we need to do a macro cost benefit analysis. Should we stretch the grid? Individual benefits, yes. Individual can benefit from a lot, but stretching the grid into even smaller cities in Pakistan has cost us a lot. How far do we stretch the grid? When I was in the Planning Commission, we faced this issue. And one of the reasons that we've lost 12 trillion, about 10 trillion rupees over the last 12 years is because we stretched the grid too far and because we can't collect bills. So we should really think about how far we can take this idea. And secondly, we also need to take into account economic geography. I mean, should we stretch the grid to every small hamlet, or should we stretch the grid only to cities, or should there be local grids? These are macro questions that need to be answered before we do a behavioral study. These macro questions are far more important from a policy point of view, because there is a subsidy involved. There is a huge loss involved, and the economy has suffered so much from electricity losses or even gas losses that we really have to take a bigger picture before we get too quickly into giving everybody electricity. I know it sounds very nice that all the poor people in the world should have electricity and all the very nice goods in the world, but in any country, not in a poor country, in any country, it needs to be very carefully examined how far you can take things. So that's a very important thing to do. I would argue that big cities, big centers need electricity before the smaller centers. Harsh as it may sound, but no development can be uniform. Even in the US, development is not uniform. Even in the US, the grid is not stretched to many places. So we have to think about there are 2 or 3 grids and they don't reach everywhere. So I think it's a very important thing to think about. Now, aspirations are important and stress is important. I fully agree with you. But aspirations and stress also vary across regions. What are the demands of people in this country? The poor aspirations, PIDE has done a lot of work. I wish you had looked at it. The aspirations of the poor are very, very difficult thing to deal with. The aspirations of the poor have been destroyed in this country on many levels. Cities are made for the rich, they're not made for the poor. So while we are talking about Waziristan, of course, let's look at our own poor here in Lahore, Islamabad. Islamabad is a city made for the rich and the poor have been ruled out. So let's also bear that in context that we have no pro-poor policy before we go to Waziristan. And Waziristan people, they have been, the merged areas people, they have been migrating, they have been making a living of migration. And perhaps the future for them will be migration, and we have to think about it. The birth of development economics really began with the idea of rural-urban mobility. But later on, somehow this notion has crept in that people should be served wherever they are. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. People have to migrate from poor places to rich places. This happened all over the world, and it will happen here too. So if we keep population static and think that we should serve their stress and aspirations where they are, I think that is really not an idea that we can live with, because even if you look at the US, for example, the reason that the US does so well is because they've got a very mobile population. And there's now talk within the academic community in the US that US population is becoming more static now. And that's one of the reasons that the US population, that the US economy may not be as resilient as it was. But traditionally, US mobility has made the population very resilient. Now, when we think of providing people all the public goods at their places of residence, wherever they are, without taking migration into account, we may end up making large policy errors, as we have in Pakistan, because we, as I said, in the old period of rural industrialization, rural electrification, we made big mistakes in terms of trying to serve people where they are. We killed the initiative to migrate, and we did not serve the poor well. So I think there's a lot of contextual stuff that we need to discuss around the study. While I agree with Michael's things that yes, stress and all these things are important, but context is now what the UNDP has to supply for us to go to the policy level. And I look forward to seeing the context provided by UNDP. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadeem sir. Thank you for your comments. Professor Price also wanted to speak. Over to you.
Thank you. And I think both of the discussions were great and were spot on. I just wanted to clarify a couple things with it. That I want to say that so to Nadeem Saab's comments on it, I completely agree that I would never argue that stress and aspiration gaps should be the biggest cost that you focus on. It's more saying, here are other costs that are important and that should be considered in the calculation if you're looking at what are the costs and benefits of electrification and you're thinking about where should investments be guided. So this isn't, I kind of, because of time, skipped over all these, but I think those things, the types of large macro costs and the issues that you have are there. I would argue that these are costs that are going to push it even further in the direction of, it's probably the return on the investment of thinking about massive grid expansion into the merged areas or just globally on it is probably a misguided policy and and there are real costs that we are considering. So I fully agree, and if I was making it seem like I think these are more important than others, it's not. It was simply highlighting that there are other costs that have escaped our attention on it. It could be real and that could have long run sustained with it. In terms of the Secretary's comments on it, again, I also fully agree with it that there is an important role for solar, and it was good to hear that they're thinking about the importance of mini grids or solar on it. And I think that the takeaway with this is once you start, if you're thinking about connections on it, solar, there's an important role for solar, and that this focus that comes out a lot on formal grid connections and connection to the grid and grid expansion in and of itself is not necessarily the smartest pathway forward. So I think both discussions were great, and it's actually good to see that there is this focus on it and these concerns, and it's not just bought into the secret sauce that electrification is the end all be all on it, that it's thinking deeper. What are the costs and benefits, and what are the trade-offs on it, and are these the right investments to make for the region and for the well-being of individuals? So I just wanted to clarify on that and thank the discussants.
Also, Nadeem sir, UNDP's recently concluded a study on the electrification challenges across merged areas, which echoes the Secretary Saab's comments, because we did a deep analysis of the existing structures and we have proposed policy solutions echoing Secretary Saab's sentiments. We've actually calculated the subsidy the federal government provides to TESCO, and that's a huge sum. And then we've also proposed that looking into mini microgrids and solarization in the presence of a culture where bill repayment is an issue, and also a statutory regulation which exempts the domestic users from paying bills till 2023. I'd be happy to share a copy of that. Also, we have a question from one of our participants, Mr. Imran Zahoor Saab. He's worked at the PNT at the government of KP. He's inquired if the microgrids for rural electrification are indeed a globally discussed model and currently in experimental phases. Considering the socio-economic indicators of merged areas and the improvements we foresee, these grids, in his opinion, seem like an unsustainable option with regard to scalability for the future, considering that 12.8% of the rise annually in demand, and the grid operations, considering the technical know-how needed to operate them. He's inquired if that cost will be proportionate to the outcome intended. So, Secretary Saab, would you want to take this question?
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat the question.
The participants inquired if the grids that we were proposing, to him, this seemed like an unsustainable option, because he's of the opinion that the grids may not be, the scalability of these grids is an issue in the future, and the fact that there's limited technical know-how needed to operate them. So is that a sustainable solution given these realities? And also, will the cost of installing these grids and the operational and maintenance costs associated with them, will that cost be proportionate to the intended outcome and output which is expected?
I'm sorry. The question presumes that the alternative is feasible. What I'm suggesting is that the alternative is not feasible by any calculation, and therefore at different places, mini and micro grids based on small hydel or micro hydel and solar, battery-backed solar would be more feasible only if the capex can be picked up. Of course, no merged area wide study has been done on this. We have now started along with the World Bank mapping study, which will indicate the opportunities in terms of such micro and mini grids. I'm not saying that is feasible. I'm not saying, of course, by the very definition, the mini and micro grids are not scalable. They're not supposed to be, but with the capex being fully paid by a donor, which can be the federal or provincial government or an international financial institution, and the OPEX being taken up by the community, and for that all of us know that the community will have to be organized in a certain way, and training and capacity will have to be provided within the community. That seems to be the only feasible solution for going forward. And having said that, going back to what I said earlier in my comments, actually the provision of 24/7 electricity to the areas that are today connected to the grid also depends on that kind of community mobilization, which encourages payment of bills. Because as long as that is done, there's no way that the government can continue to provide continuous electricity.
Thank you, Secretary Saab. Sir, we have another question for you. The question's from Hidayatullah Saab from SMEDA. He's inquired that given the number of industries in the merged areas, especially which are adjacent to Peshawar and which are increasing day by day and are being affected by the electricity supply to households, is there any policy for those industries to conduct energy audits or to save energy?
If I've understood the question correctly, because I lost your voice in between, there are industrial estates inside the tribal areas in Khyber, where the industrial feeders are separate from the residential feeders. But of course, there are areas where small industries are on the same feeders where there are domestic consumers too. So the answer to this is that depending on the feasibility of any particular areas industries, their feeders can be separated from the residential consumers feeders, but that depends on the amount of electricity being consumed in that area.
Thank you, Ji. We have another question from Mohammed Ali Qureshi. He's working at the SARC Energy Center. He's inquired what could be done at the macro policy level to create an enabling environment for the private sector to invest in rural electrification projects. So Nadeem Saab, if you would like to comment on this.
Can you repeat the question?
Gigi, the question is what can be done at the macro policy level to create an enabling environment for the private sector to invest in rural electrification projects?
Nothing. And nothing should be done. Rural electrification should not be a priority. It is only a priority for donors because we don't need to prioritize rural electrification. There is a cost to prioritizing rural electrification. And if the donors are willing to give a subsidy, which they're not, we should not go for that. Simple. People should migrate to cities, live in cities if they want electricity. If they don't want electricity, should live in rural areas, period.
And I would like to add to what Dr. Haque is saying, agreeing to what he has said. The point here is you electrify the rural areas, you provide subsidized electricity. That will never be feasible. What we are going to do at the macro policy level is we are going to privatize the distribution companies. We are going to separate distribution business and supply business. And once that is done, once, for example, Tesco, the tribal electricity supply company, is privatized, then the private sector, the private investor would see how feasible it is to electrify the villages. And as I said earlier, the feasibility of connection to the grid would never be there. But even if that is, the questions of subsidy being provided and the returns being earned by the private investor would not make any sense for a private distributor. But of course, that will happen when we actually privatize Tesco.
Well noted, Ji. Professor Price had a comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think just to follow up on the response to this question and a theme that's come up several times. I mean, I think really one of the biggest challenges when you're thinking about electrification, and this is not just in the merged areas, it's not just in the context of Pakistan, it's globally with it, is this issue about bill repayment. And it's this vicious cycle with it. Private capital is not going to flow into electrification on it if you have an unreliable system with low levels of repayment. You have low levels of repayment and you have large levels of loss because the system is unreliable. Who at the end of the day is going to reliably pay for 4 hours of electricity that's unreliable, right? It's this theme. There are so many times with it where you go out and this comes up, and it's this trap. Again, it's another version of a poverty trap. It's that but you have this repayment trap. You have a poor quality service because it's relying upon subsidies and it's underinvested and it's stretched. So Nadeem said, like you said, you stretch the grid, you're going to have an unreliable grid. You have an unreliable grid. Why are people going to pay for the service? If people aren't paying, the government can only support it and put so much in subsidizing on. So there is this vicious cycle. And this is where I think things like, and in the African context, I know there's been a lot of work on microgrids and solar as this complement and to improve reliability, and that there is some evidence that repayment actually has increased with this. And so I think hearing the Secretary, I think it's very promising. Yes, there are challenges and issues that are still there, and you have to think about them simultaneously, and the repayment is there. But I think solar and mini grids or hydro and mini grids to get reliability and focusing on reliability so that then you can tackle the repayment problem. I don't think if you have limited access in an unreliable system, you can forget about repayment. It's just not going to happen. I know of nothing and no example where you could come up with people are going to pay for poor quality service, right? But I think once you have repayment and if you get repayment, private dollars will flow. You can't convince me that if an investor says I can recover my investments and I can reliably have people repay, that they won't flow in. It's not that we have globally a limited ability to generate the electricity that we need. It's that nobody has the financial incentive to do that right now. So I wish, because I think moving forward, if I were to say what is the area that the focus on, it should be around the repayment. And before you want to think about any kind of expansion, it has to be what can you do? What are the drivers of non-repayment, and what are the investments that you can make to improve repayment?
We just building on that, we have a question from a participant. They've inquired that what is the government and Bhutta doing to ensure collection of bills in the merged areas? Does the government have a plan post 2023? Is there some mechanism that is being put in place for revenue collection?
No, as you yourself pointed out, there's an SRO, and even before that SRO was issued, since the creation of Pakistan, that has been it has been almost a settled principle with the population of the tribal areas that they are not going to pay the bills.
Yeah.
His question in particular was post 2023 when the SRO won't be applicable. But we have another question for Dr. Haque. The participants inquired, how are we going to give electricity to agricultural tube wells if we don't electrify rural areas?
I think the answer is very clear. Solar is available. They can use that, and they don't need to subsidize tube wells. We need to be clear that this policy of tube wells, you see, again, Marium, let's get back to the basics for a minute. We've had all these suggestions coming from donors because they have no skin in the game. They give us these suggestions: subsidize tube wells, subsidize this, subsidize that, subsidize rural electrification, use IPPs. We end up carrying the bill. We have paid dearly for this. And now the fund comes along, and I used to work for the fund, as you mentioned. Fund comes along and rightly says, raise the price. I support the fund in raising the price. But we raised the price because not accountable consultants and donors came and gave us these bad policies. We have to take charge of our own policy and we have to take charge of our own situation. We don't need to stretch the grid. Bill collection is not a problem. When you do this nonsense about stretching the grid and giving everybody electricity because you feel that they'll have less stress or aspirations or whatever, you create a problem. We have to be realistic in our policy and make a policy that allows electricity bills to be collected, stretches grid as far as it can, and let people be without electricity if they want to live in nice, comfortable areas. Doesn't mean that every Haveli, every landlord should get electricity for their tube bills. Sorry, we should be hard-headed about it. We have to have a hard policy in electricity. On collection of bills, it's very simple. We've talked about it for ages. When I was in the Planning Commission, I worked hard, very hard on it, and we failed. We can have simple pay-as-you-go meters. We work on pay-as-you-go phones. Why can't we have pay-as-you-go meters? But that doesn't suit anybody. Even the donors, Asian Development Bank wanted to buy the meters for us. Why do you want to buy meters for us? Why can't we buy our own meters? We need a good dialogue between us, Marium. We have to have a good dialogue between us. What do we want? Do we want to stretch the grid? Do we want meters from Asian Development Bank? Do we want consultants to come and tell us to give rural electrification and then we pay the bill? I think that's the model that we've been running on right now, and we have to be clear on that. Thank you.
Secretary Saab, any concluding remarks? We'll be closing the seminar
now. Thank you. This remark is not just about the tribal areas. The tribal areas, it is a given principle that electricity is a right and should not be paid for. But parts of other parts of KP, significant parts of Balochistan and parts of Sindh, electricity is treated as a right. We have to change the culture and start treating electricity as a commodity that is produced by the market and is paid for. Unless that transition happens, our goals of sustainable, reliable, affordable electricity will not be met.
Thank you, Secretary Saab. Thank you so much. This
Marium,
brings us to the end of the seminar.
Raised hands. Are you not going to take them?
Actually, the time of the seminar was scheduled for an hour.
Okay, but in PID, we have a tradition of taking questions that people answer. So I think we should take the questions because we don't care about the time. We need a local dialogue. We don't need to listen only to outsiders. We need local.
I will stay and answer questions as long as people want. So
that's perfect. I actually I had mentioned in the beginning that for the participants, please type in your questions so that I'll be able to then articulate.
We are sharing the platform, Marium. I think in PID we have a tradition of letting people talk because we feel it's very important.
Please type out the question.
I know donors don't like people to talk, but we like people to talk.
So Nadeem Sabi, that's spoken like somebody from a true Chicago background. So I've spent much time at Chicago, so I appreciate that.
Sure, Ji. I lost the. All right. So I'm just going to read out the questions. I'm just trying to sort it out. Just give me a second. All right. So we have another question from Asad Mahmood Saab. He's inquired that is there any guidelines or a facilitation mechanism for communities which are being proposed by AEDB or provincial energy departments for inefficient solar panels? Is there some steps that can be taken in this regard? Do we have any guidelines or a facilitation mechanism to address?
Is the question addressed to me? I'm not aware of any. I think that if there is a provincial government representative in the seminar from the energy department, they might be able to respond.
I think Imran Saab has worked at the PNT government of KP. If you would like to add to this. Also, we have another question for Nadeem sir. The questions for you. Can you please explain pay-as-you-go meters and how can they be implemented in the merged areas?
Pay-as-you-go meters exist everywhere in the world. They've existed for 100 years in all over the world. I remember when my father went to Oxford before I was born, pay-as-you-go meters were available then. When I went to LSE, pay-as-you-go meters were available then. It's simply you buy a card just like your cell phone and you put it in and you can use the electricity that's on your card. So very simple. We used to use coins, but those things exist and they should be used. And we have talked about that in the Planning Commission at least for 15, 20 years now. The problem is that the donor consultants put a stop to it and we don't seem to get on with it, and the local mafias put a stop to it. Pay-as-you-go meters are very simple. I was in Nigeria in 2016. They had a pay-as-you-go meter. Simple. You just take a card, punch it in, you have 5,000 rupees of electricity or 10,000 rupees of electricity, and you can only consume that amount of electricity and no more. So that's a simple solution that should be put in place. There's some people here, Hamid, Naveed, and Muhammad Sharia. If you want to take them.
I'm just going to give them. Ji Hamid sir, go ahead and ask your question, please.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Hamid Naveed, Chief Rural Development from KPP&D Department. My question from sir, who is leading the Energy Department at federal level, is it not that the cost of the energy is very high in our country? And what he shared that there is a theft of electricity in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, and the poor people cannot afford to pay the high prices. If we decrease the cost of energy to the people, will it not increase the collection and revenue mean a bit higher as compared to with this high cost?
The short answer to your question is yes. If the prices of electricity were lower, the payment would theoretically be higher. But the reality is that even when the cost of electricity was less, the theft of electricity was actually higher. So if you construct a time series on theft and the prices, you will actually see no correlation. Theft is an extremely complex phenomenon. There are multiple factors that go into this. Even when in the previous question we were talking about pay-as-you-go meters. Pay-as-you-go meters without the investments in the infrastructure where ABC cables are also there, which make it more difficult to get an off-meter kunda, as we call it, would not be useful. So yes, lower prices of electricity would be good, but then what can one actually do about that? As the prices of electricity, again, are determined by the market. So if the price of gas, price of furnace oil, price of coal go up as they are going up, the price of electricity will go up.
We have another question from Meher Zaidi. Meher, I'm going to unmute you if you can please pose your question.
Ji, Assalamu alaikum. I really appreciate today's seminar, and the talk of Mr. Price was really interesting. And my question to both Mr. Price and especially the Secretary Power Division is that isn't it high time that we made the approach through empowering women to make into the decision making approach, like we always make the policies through top-down approach and involving communities and especially women into access to power and rural electrification, especially FATA areas. And I really appreciate the Secretary Power Division of his, what he said about using off-grid solutions, because as Dr. Nadeem pointed out, supplying on-grid solutions to non-financial benefit areas is obviously it's very bad for Pakistan. We just can't do it. So if they would like to include, like women and especially communities in their approach to access to power. Thank you.
Professor Price, would you like to respond first?
So, yeah, I'll respond to parts of it. So again, I think there's a common theme coming through this. I guess maybe it's a glass half full, glass half empty view on what the end policy goal should be with it in terms of electrification. And I think the sense that rural electrification is a losing proposition is based under the current model with it. And I think there's a cycle, and I think it's a set of questions that are just as tricky as poverty cycles or aspiration traps or any of these. I think it's really hard to de-link how much of the fact that it's a losing bet for a government. And this is true whether you're talking about the merged areas in Pakistan, if you're talking about rural parts of Bangladesh, if you're talking about rural areas in Nepal, Africa, it doesn't matter. The question is, can you break that cycle with it? And to the Secretary, is the sense that it's a losing proposition, is this based upon the level of loss on it, or is it so if constraints and the financial constraints were relaxed and that repayment was high and you had levels of repayment and levels of loss that were consistent with what you see in Europe or in the US or Canada or Australia with it, would it be feasible to then electrify?
Not necessarily. You see, the pricing structures are also important for the tribal areas, and I would like to focus only on the tribal areas. The levels of poverty in all the 7 districts and the subdivisions, which were earlier FRs, are so high that most consumers there would qualify for subsidized, highly subsidized rates of electricity. So in that, but that is a cost that the federal government is willing to bear. That subsidy is, so it will never be financially fully feasible. But the socioeconomic policy of the government dictates that subsidy, at least currently, that subsidy will be provided to those who consume less than 200 kilowatt hours over a month. So it will not be feasible if there's a 100% payment of bills, and today there is a 0% payment of bills. So it will not be financially feasible, but the federal government is willing to pick up that subsidy, and therefore it will become feasible for the distributor.
That's with again with the current levels of subsidies and the current cost of generation, with the source of generation being something where there is non-zero marginal cost of production, right? So again, I think the role of subsidies being a constraint on electrification and subsidies being a constraint on the system and the real financial costs of subsidies and loss on that. Again, I think this just all reinforces the potential benefits of investments in solar and hydro, where the marginal costs of generation are low on it. And so then prices fall with it. As you expand, right? Yes, you have the fixed costs. So you absolutely have to worry about recovering the costs of the fixed costs of building, but then the marginal cost of generation for these are low enough that, again, it's a cycle, and I'm not trying to suggest that I'm not sure how you break it. But
yes, I agree. These are the issues, and of course, I will not go into the macro problems where subsidy is there, where theft and losses are there, but a number of other factors too. So yeah, I'll agree.
We have last 3 questions from participants. I'll just have the participants share their questions, and then the speakers can decide who would want to take on these. So just back-to-back questions. So Amir Saab, you've been wanting to ask something. I'm unmuting you, so you can please share your question. Amir Durrani Saab, I've unmuted you, so you can please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Gee, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So I was listening very keenly to the webinar, and I liked what I heard from the secretary towards the end about people attitudinally thinking of electricity subsidies as rights, or in fact, electricity as a right, so they want free electricity. And I'm going to focus now primarily on our experience in the merged districts. I, in fact, was out there and have been meeting PIDE since 2018. I came back from Darosh and then Arandu. They are very much neighboring Bajor and all these areas. I have 3 things which I think you can call questions, or I need comments from both the professor and the secretary, and possibly somebody who is more versed with the provincial what's happening. So the first thing is, I think the mode of thinking, and I want to ask them, that the government is encouraging is that centralized supply will continue all across the country, whereas we think that in these merged districts, being distant enough from central sources of energy, distributed energy resources, and promoting localized electricity and its distribution is really going to help in the price being determined market-like. Number 2, why are they not using, and in fact, a lot of donors are actually crowding out good work that was already done in these areas or neighboring areas where community-driven power had almost started to take root. A great example is what GIZ has just done in Karak and in that's a very strange name, I keep forgetting, but really that's a part of the merged districts, where they actually have gone in and with no sense for localized recovery, which was actually the deal with the community, they provided an oversized solar plant with storage for this local community. So that's the second. Why are the donors not cognizant? Why? I do know the World Bank's doing work on off-grid microgrids in Pakistan, but it's something I think nobody has woken up to, because the thing is, this is a phenomenon right now. More than 50 megawatts of recognized microgrids exist in Pakistan. Third thing, which I want to also say, that when we talk, and I want to ask the government per se, the government should start talking about energy security in a localized manner rather than in a centralized manner. I mean, the whole narrative of we are now generating 30,000, we this month, we consume the peak power, Ahmad gets on TV. All this needs to be stopped, because that is really what tells people that we will be waiting for Godot, if you get my drift. So, you go there, you do a community dialogue, and all the people that says, oh, well, Mr. Rani, eventually the government's going to come here. And I keep trying to translate the play, Waiting for Godot, for them. They laugh at it, but I think it's the government who's responsible for this absence of attitudinal shift. Thank you so much, Marium.
Thank you, Amisa. If the discussants and the speakers are in agreement, can I go ahead and also ask the other participants to share their questions, and then we can just respond to them first?
Please do.
Thank you. Shahryar Sahab, I'm unmuting you. If you can please put your question forward. Mohammed
Okay,
Shahryar.
thank you, Marium. Yeah, so I'm from Harness Energy, and we've been working in rural areas in South Punjab and Sindh for the past 5 years, and we're a distributor of decentralized system. Complete agreement with Nadeem Saab and Amir Saab, who just asked the question that centralized power, those are days of the past, especially because of transmission and distribution losses. So I think one of the most effective ways that we have seen over the past 2 years, and we focused on Sangar, Laya, and Jhang, these areas in Punjab that are very bad grid and some areas are off grid, is actually small portable size solar home systems. And I'm exclusively talking about home consumption right now. Of course, for agricultural tubules and for industries, I don't know what the solution is. But because most of the households in merged areas, from the research that we've done, their base load is basically 1 to 3 fans or 5-10 lights and mobile charging. That's what most of the people need, and that can be done very effectively using the private sector and combining with local NGOs or microfinance institutions. And we are currently doing this. So people pay us about 3,000 rupees, 2,500 rupees a month in these rural areas in 12 to 24 months, and they're getting really reliable lighting, mobile charging, and fans all the time. So this is a humble suggestion, and I would like to hear what the secretary and Mr. Nadeem says about this.
Thank you, Shahryar Sahab. Yaya, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Mariam. I like to bring in some data points. I think we have collectively talked about many things, but we haven't talked much on the data. So I'm going to bring some data, and this is data from the government mostly. So in merged areas, around 55 to 57% of the households are electrified. That's number one. Within this 55%, people have reported that they only get 4 to 6 hours of electricity. This is from the AIP baseline survey recently conducted. Now moving on to some interesting data points. Around 93% of the households, they have reported to have one or more solar panels in their household. So already many of them, like a big majority, 93%, have some sort of solarization going on. So this is something that that is an opportunity, and we can look into this and facilitate better solarization, perhaps maybe. The last data point is also from one of the surveys recently conducted. That was business assessment survey, and this is something where I want participants to focus right now, and that is 81% of the business, they reported that electricity is their number one problem right now. So just to combine all these points, so the households, we see they are moving towards solarization as they feel the need, and as many of the participants have pointed out that there's no point in investing a lot in the grid electricity, and people can move towards their own alternate supply. But for the commercial business, and this is why it is also significant, because as part of rehabilitation of this particular area, we don't want more outward migration. We want people to stay there. We want people to rehabilitate and bring back their business and economic opportunities. We need to have some level of facilitation to the commercial areas, at least commercial business at least, so that they flourish here. They don't take their business outside. So these are some of the points I thought I should bring in the table. And lastly, I did not introduce myself. I am working currently as a consultant in merged areas governance projects. That's how I have known these data points. Thank you again.
Thank you, Yaya. Thank you for your questions. So now, Secretary, would you like to first go ahead and comment on the questions that were asked?
Yes, very quickly, because then I will have to leave after this response. By 12:30, I have to be in alignment. On the questions comments by Yaya and the gentleman before him, that actually underlines what Dr. Haque already said. If the society and government's actions to address those social actions do not adjust, market will do what it has to do. So 93% of the people of the respondents in that survey in the tribal area saying that they have some sort of access to solar panels actually underscores that the market is adjusting to the social and government's dynamics. On the questions by Mr. Durrani on his comments, yes, that is what distributed supply is. What I was referring to in my initial comments, and community-driven is power distribution mechanism through mini and microgrids. KP, I incidentally, Marium was Secretary Finance in KP, but before that I was also Secretary Energy in KP. And KP had this famous project of 315 microhydel systems in the north of KP. And at the same time, there was also this project of distribution of home-based solar systems. I'm not sure what the status of those projects are and why similar other projects have not been taken up. But as Mr. Durrani said, there is this continuous struggle to get the grid extended and get it extended without there being a feasibility for it. I think there needs to be a clear message to these communities that local production and distribution is the answer to their solutions, their false hopes that unfortunately some of our politicians then generate need to be quashed because it's not going to happen, and the solution is what Mr. Durrani was suggesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Saab. Thank you so much. Nadeem Saab would like, sure. Professor Price, please go ahead.
So, Nadeem Saab, if you want to go, I can go after you.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So just a couple comments on it. I think that the question about donors' intent. So I'll be the cynic in saying I think donors make bad decisions, and that donors with it in these projects, it's a combination of they follow the lead on, they hear that electrification is important. So think about it in the context of electrification. Oh, we need to expand the grid. And they create investments around expanding the grid. And they, as Nadeem Saab has mentioned many times, it's that you have to understand the context. There isn't a one-size-fits-all, but donors like to have a one-size-fits-all approach to solutions on it. And not only do they not recognize context on the ground, they issue evidence that they don't understand what works, and that they just think we have money and we're going to tell people what to do. Since we have the purse strings, this is it. So I think with a donor intent, I think there's a trap. The dollars that they're offering are great, but they come at a real cost with it. And I think it's important for initiatives, and it's positive for me to see as an academic on it, that more and more organizations are trying to involve academics with it, whether it's economists or other social scientists or other physical scientists, on saying, we should be using evidence, and we should have science to inform decisions, and that they're working with the local governments or the local communities on it. But I think we need to push it further, and I think this fits in nicely with with John List's seminar earlier on this about scalability and the science of science, and breaking this idea that it should be policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy or going upon a gut. So I think understanding donors' intent and recognizing that just because they have dollars doesn't mean that they have wisdom on it, and there's need for research on it. I'd also like to make a comment on the localized markets idea, and I think that there's a lesson to be learned. If anybody, I don't know if any of you have followed some of the crises that have happened recently in Texas on it, and that there is risk of having too localized of markets on it, or at least a poorly run localized market. And Texas is the poster child for that, where because Texas decided to basically handle all distribution, generation, and transmission and shut themselves off, they basically created a mini grid within the US and are not integrated with the rest of the market. You've had, there were issues where prices went up 1,000-fold on it, and that people were going without electricity in winter for several weeks because the system basically collapsed with it. So I think, again, there's a trade-off and a balancing act between feasibility and at the local level, but also having the ability, particularly when you're thinking about renewables with intermittency problems and lack of storage, that there's not an easy solution for it. So while there are benefits and there are certainly things about localized solutions and localized markets that look great, there are also some concerns. And so I think discussions like this are great, that they really highlight costs and benefits and trade-offs, and that we should think about, that there aren't easy solutions, so that we're using information and using data to think about problems. And just in general, I think to close, to kind of close my thoughts on this, again, it's positive for me to see the openness and the importance that it seems that solar or mini grids and hydro and non-grid, non-formal grid sources are going to play. I think these are incredibly important if you want to have any thoughts of mass expansion, not just this isn't just in the tribal areas, the merged areas, this is globally with it. But there's still an important issue there, and that's the reliability and the thinking about intermittency with it. And so when you're talking about solar, when you're thinking about hydro, if you're thinking about wind, there's the intermittency problem. And so that there also has to be thoughts about storage on it. And as the last for that, Nadeem Saba, I think you're right. There should be more focus on pay as you go. I think that's an underutilized, and I'm not sure. And again, it gets back to donor intent. I'm not sure why there is such hesitancy on it. I mean, I think the evidence on pay as you go is very positive, and I think it alleviates a lot of the concerns. And if there is interest on it, I think looking how can you make that feasible in it with it is should be part of the policy solution. So I think it's this, think outside of the box with it. And it's a challenging problem. And I think this is why you have so much discussion on it. So I thank everybody for their comments and their questions, and the other panelists, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Price. Nadeem.
Gee, Marium, thank you very much. I think it's been wonderful. I think we should collaborate more. We urge all donors to work with us and help us generate a debate locally. I'm surprised why people are so reticent on the donor side to do it. Michael, you pointed out correctly that there is a tension between globalization and localization. The global bureaucracy does not want local solutions, does not want to empower the local people to derive their own solutions, which is kind of sad to see, but it is very much there. We recently started in a whole unit to start evaluating donors. And I'm very sad to say that despite letters to donors, nobody wants to talk to PIDE about evaluating them, which is very interesting that despite all this talk about transparency and global governance and this, donors feel that they're above local evaluation. So I think this is a big problem. But we've had huge episodes of misconceived policies by donors and their consultants, and we are paying the price for it. And yet this is a subject that's supposed to be taboo, and people don't want to talk about it because somehow we think that all donors are basically altruistic. And I think that model has been challenged many times, but needs to be challenged locally. Our policymakers need to think it through, that the donors don't come with great reports and wonderful reports, and things happen very well after those reports. We have suffered a lot. In IPP policy, we lost a huge amount of money in that. with subsidy policies, we've lost a lot of money in that. And we really should begin to talk to each other. So I welcome this effort by the UNDP. I hope we will continue this. I hope we will do many more seminars together, webinars together. The webinar issue has really democratized the debate, whereas previously we could not go everywhere and talk to people. Now we can. So I hope that the donors will see this and will come and join us, and let's have a debate. Let's have a debate. We don't care about local or whatever. We just want to talk about our country and make it work if we can. And the solutions lie at home, not necessarily outside. So thank you very much, Marium. We will inshallah do it again. All the best. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ji. This brings us to the end of the seminar. I would like to extend a big thank you to all our speakers, the discussants, and participants who joined in today. And we're very grateful to PIDE for the collaboration today, and your communication and logistical team who have been very gracious and extended all their support. So thank you so much, sir. And thank you to all the participants. So I'm going to conclude the meeting now. So thank you. Hafiz.